This morning, I don't know if you've ever suffered from the problem that I have, heartburn, but probably you have. But the heartburn that I want to talk about this morning is different than the heartburn that I gave to my oldest son when he was just a little guy. It wasn't funny, really, when I think back about it. But the one thing it did, I'll tell you the story. I was speaking at a men's conference down in Washington, and I met a biker there, a Hell's Angel, and I had the privilege of sharing Christ with him, and man, he had heartburn, I'll tell you. He said, I'm on fire, Wayne. He said, I've caught fire this weekend, and it's the fire of God, right? It's the fire of God, and I know it is, and my life is never going to be the same. And he said, I'd really like you to come over to our house for dinner before you fly back to Canada. And I said, well, I'd love to do that. And he said, I've got some fresh moose steaks that I'd love to cook you up a moose steak. And so I went over, and man, it was a huge steak. Way too big for anybody. There's no way that I could eat all that steak. I know you don't believe that, but I couldn't. It was huge. And he went in, he said, but Wayne, he said, I got to give you something that you've probably never had before. And he said, even though you've been around a lot, he said, I don't think you've had these before. And he went and he got these peppers, a jar of peppers. And I think they were from somewhere down in Mexico where he got them. And he said, Wayne, he said, I'm going to warn you ahead of time. These come out hotter than they go in. And I thought, oh my goodness. So he was daring me. I couldn't help it. He was daring me. Try these peppers. It was the hottest thing I've ever tasted in my life. And he was right, too. Anyway, I come home. He sent home a jar of these peppers with me back here to Calgary. And so I pulled them out for our first meal as a family after I got back from this conference. And I said to my oldest son, Greg, I said, Greg, you gotta try these peppers. These peppers are just the most amazing thing you've ever tasted, right? And he's looking at me, he knows me pretty well by now. He's about 10 or 12, and he says, you think I do? And I said, oh yeah, you do, son. You need to try these peppers. Well, he took a nibble on the end of this one pepper, and man, he went red as a beet, and it was like fire was coming out of his eyes, right? But he went ahead and he ate the whole pepper. And so I had one to match him, and of course the other folks around the table, the other family, they weren't touching it, right? But he'd had a taste of major heartburn. Well, now, with my family, I created a monster because you can't get anything hot enough for Greg. He's down in the States, he travels all over the world, and you cannot get anything hot enough for him. He brings us the hottest sauces you've ever tasted. I just tried a sample the other day of a new bottle of barbecue sauce he got from Texas. And I tried it. Oh my gosh, talk about hot. This is just too much, even for me. And my little granddaughter, Molly, she just loves all the hot sauce. And my grandson, Jameson. And so the other night, when Molly and Marilyn came down from Red Deer, Marilyn's been up there babysitting for the grandkids, and they were invited to join with me for the Filipino fellowship. Thank God it's Friday service on Friday evening here in the chapel. And we just had the most amazing time. Just the most amazing time. They had the most amazing time. But she was ready to leave afterwards because I promised her I'd take her out for a special burger, and she could put hot sauce on it, right? Put hot sauce on it. So we had an awesome time, and I couldn't resist. The Filipino fellowship here is such an amazing group of people, and I've had the privilege for so many years of ministering to their friends and family members in the city here, even in other churches. And I've enjoyed the fellowship so much, and they gave me this wonderful gift on Marilyn and I, this wonderful gift. But the real highlight of the gift that they presented us with, it was so generous. But they had someone do a caricature of me. I didn't want to show you the picture today. I thought about it, but I thought, no, they'll say, boy, Wayne really does have heartburn in that picture. I'm telling you. It was actually a pretty good rendition, if I do say so myself. I could compete with some of those folks on the streets of San Francisco, that get those drawings done, those caricatures done. So I had the most amazing time, and I shared with them a story. And it's a story that's a favorite of mine because he's one of my heroes. Pastor Jose and I, and Pastor Michael, we have that Methodist background, right? And a number of our Filipino people here came out of the Methodist church in the Philippines. And I asked them to put their hands up in the fellowship the other night, and I couldn't believe how many. I see the hands back there. Bless you guys. And I said, do you know, Pastor Jose, I may have a story that you haven't thought of for a while. You know the story. But do you know who died on April the 27th, 242 years ago? And Pastor Jose wasn't sure. He knew it had to be connected, of course, to John Wesley, because John Wesley was the founder of the Methodist Church. And we wouldn't be here. This is a great old Methodist church, this church. And we wouldn't even be here if it wasn't for John Wesley and the Methodist heritage. But John Wesley wouldn't have had a major case of heartburn if it wasn't for a fellow named Peter Böhler. Peter Böhler died 242 years ago, this past Thursday. Peter Böhler was a Moravian missionary in the Moravian church, a German church, and he had such amazing faith in God and confidence in the Spirit and such joy. He had such an impact on Wesley. Now, you may not know the story, but John Wesley, he came from England as an Oxford scholar. As an Oxford scholar, a minister. He was an Anglican priest, and he came to Georgia. Georgia. You're from Georgia. That's right, yeah. John Wesley came to Georgia years ago, back in the 18th century, as a missionary to Georgia. He got there, and you know what? He got so discouraged. He got so down. The message that he was giving them was from the head. It was from the head. He had this scholarly message to share. He had all this, truth in his noodle, right? He had lots in his noodle. John Wesley was the one who eventually said the difference between heaven and hell is only 18 inches. It's from the heart to the head, right? And John Wesley lived it, and he experienced it. And so John Wesley preached and preached and preached with no results. He was so discouraged, he decided, that's it, I'm going back to England. I'm a total failure, right? So he's on board ship, and they're crossing the Atlantic Ocean, and there's a huge storm. Just a tremendous storm. And I don't know if you've ever been out on the water when it's really rough. I haven't, not on the ocean so much, but I remember I was really glad when we were out fishing one time with my father-in-law, and that he was an old Navy guy who could handle a boat in a storm, because we ran into a real bad storm, and it was very scary, but he got us in safely. But Peter Böhler was on board that ship with a group of Moravian Christians. And John Wesley, he was kind of hiding out in his room, I don't know what they called it back then in that ship, but anyway, in his cabin. He was hiding out in the cabin, and he was scared stiff in this storm that he was going to die. He was terrified. And he realized something. He wasn't ready to die. He wasn't ready to die. He was afraid of death. And so John Wesley was cowering in his cabin, and then what would he hear in the middle of this terrible storm? Singing. Beautiful singing like we heard this morning, right? Like we shared in this morning. He heard people singing and he thought, I must be dreaming. This can't be true. So he crept out of his cabin, and the ship was just ready to flip over, he figured. But he came up on deck, and there was this group of Christians, Moravian Christians, with Peter Bowler leading, and they were singing hymns, and they were praising God. And he watched them, and he crept a little bit closer, and he saw that they had so much joy, so much enthusiasm, so much confidence, and no fear of death. They weren't worried the slightest. And it was obvious in their singing and in their prayers and their praise. Just an amazing thing for him. Nothing happened really on that ship other than the fact that he made it back to England. He didn't die, but a seed was planted in his heart. And when he got back to England, John Wesley said, I've got to find out what Peter Bowler and those Moravian Christians have that I don't have. He's got all the degrees, right? He's an Oxford Don, right? Scholarly man, brilliant preacher. But he didn't have heartburn yet. But, he goes to a little chapel, Aldersgate Chapel. And he hears that Peter Bowler and the Moravian Christians are going to be there, and Peter Bowler is going to be talking about Scripture. And he goes to this chapel, and Peter Bowler is sharing from the book of Romans. And he's talking about justification by faith. That it's by faith. That it's not about the head. It's about the heart. And as he was sitting there, this is how he described it. My heart was strangely warmed. He was never to be the same again. He was transformed. This was the beginning of his transformation. As a result, his brother Charles, the whole Wesley family, right, entered into this transformation. And many of the hymns, the great gospel hymns that we sing today, come from John and Charles Wesley, right? John said his heart was strangely warmed, and he was never to be the same again. And he wasn't. Do you know that the scholars say that John Wesley and this revival, the Wesleyan revival in England, saved England from the same bloodbath that France went through in the French Revolution. All as a result of this man, Peter Bowler, who had such heartburn. He was so filled with the Spirit. He was so empowered. He had so much joy and so much love because his heart was on fire for God. See, I think that wherever Christ is, wherever the Holy Spirit goes, people catch fire. Their hearts catch fire. That they're never to be the same again. That's what Jesus does, right? I mean, how can it not? Think of this quote. This is one of my favorite quotes from Wesley. And I had the privilege in seminary in studying all of the journals of Wesley and on the standard sermons. And when we came here, I donated a whole set of Wesleyana works to the library here at the church. And sometimes I go in there and use them and borrow them. And they're just powerful, life-changing readings. But one of the things that John wrote and lived by, he lived by this as a result of that Aldersgate heart-warming experience. He said, "Do all the good you can, by all the means you can, in all the ways you can, in all the places you can, at all the times you can, to all the people you can, as long as ever you can." Wow. Practicing that, when I was sharing the other night at the fellowship on Friday night, I mentioned to my granddaughter, I said, "Honey, if you could Live by that in your life. You never need anything else, right? That's transforming. John Wesley said, the best of it is God is with us. See, I can't live that myself. I don't have the power to live that myself. But through God's presence in my life, through the Holy Spirit, I have that power. And I love this story, that Rob read this morning. Thank you, Rob, for this powerful reading. As they talked and they discussed these things, Jesus himself suddenly came and began walking with them. He was just there. He was just there. They were in so much grief, right? And some have said, well, maybe they didn't recognize him because they were walking into the sun. Just like these lights up here, right? They're so bright. And you can't always recognize people out there. Well, some scholars have said, well, it's probably because, when Jesus came to them, they were facing that light of the sun coming up. And it was so bright. I'm not sure that's it at all. But they didn't recognize him. God kept them, it says, from recognizing him. How he did that, I don't know. Jesus asked them, what are you discussing so intently? What is it that's really got your attention, right? What is it? They stopped short. Sadness written across their faces. Then one of them, Cleopas, replied, you must be the only person in Jerusalem who hasn't heard about all the things that have happened there the last few days. What things? Jesus asked. The things that happened to Jesus, the man from Nazareth. They said he was a prophet who did powerful miracles, and he was a mighty teacher in the eyes of God and all the people. But our leading priests and other religious leaders handed him over to be condemned to death, and they crucified him. We had hoped he was the Messiah, right? The sadness, I couldn't help it. I was thinking of Wesley and how sad and how discouraged he must have been after this trip to Georgia and wanting to share Christ with people there and being such a dismal failure, right? He just couldn't believe it. And now these disciples are feeling like it just wasn't what they thought it was going to be, right? We had hoped that he was the Messiah who had come to rescue Israel. This all happened 3 days ago. Then some women from our group of his followers were at his tomb early this morning, and they came back with an amazing report. They said his body was missing, and they had seen angels who told them Jesus is alive. Some of our men ran out to see, and sure enough, his body was gone, just as the women had said. Then Jesus said to them, you foolish people, you find it so hard to believe all that the prophets wrote in the scriptures. Wasn't it clearly predicted that the Messiah would have to suffer all these things before entering his glory? Then Jesus took them through the writings of Moses and all the prophets, explaining from all the scriptures the things concerning himself. By this time they were nearing Emmaus and the end of their journey. Jesus acted as if he were going on, but they begged him, stay the night with us, since it is getting late. So he went home with them. As they sat down to eat, he took the bread and he blessed it. Then he broke it and gave it to them. Suddenly their eyes were opened and they recognized him. Now, I'm not sure if this was really like communion, right? When we think of the Last Supper. I'm not sure that's what it was. That it was that sacred act of Jesus blessing the bread and breaking the bread that caused them to recognize him. What I kind of think it was the fellowship around the table. Jesus hung out. You ever notice that about him? He hung out. He hung out with people. He hung out with his disciples. He hung out even with people who would consider him an enemy. He hung out with them. He hung out with sinners. He fellowshiped with people. And what I think comes through in that fellowship is that amazing way that he cared for people, right? Their eyes were opened and they recognized him. And at that moment, he disappeared. They said to each other, "Didn't our hearts burn within us as he talked with us on the road and explained the scriptures to us?" See, that's interesting. They said that after he had disappeared. They didn't say it before. They didn't say it when they were walking. But now they look back on what had happened and they realize, didn't our hearts burn within us when he walked with us and explained to us, when he was teaching us and explained the scriptures to us? Wow. And then they go and they're telling the others who have gathered, the 11 disciples and the others who had gathered with them. And they said, "The Lord has really risen." He appeared to Peter. Then the two from Emmaus told their story of how Jesus appeared to them as they were walking along the road and how they had recognized him as he was breaking the bread. Wow, I love that story. I love that story. There's so much that we could share, and I'd love to do it, but just not this morning. While they were walking together, he drew near, in disguise, quietly listening, unnoticed for a time. While they were talking together, he came alongside, in disguise, available, asking what they were discussing. "Don't you know," they said, "are you oblivious?" He smiled. "Tell me about it," he said. And so they did as they walked together. And he quietly listened in disguise, taking it all in. So they talked and he listened, nodding at news he already knew, already understood on a much deeper level. And when they had finished, he spoke in disguise. And he took them back in time, back through history and the prophets, back through pain and trouble and longing, back to the dawning of a plan. So they stopped for food, and he broke bread. As he had done with them only days before, he lifted the bread in disguise and lowered it as Jesus of Nazareth, resurrected one. And as their eyes were opened, he disappeared. No more need for disguise. No more need to be there in that place. And so they ran back to their friends. No more escaping, no more fleeing. And as they told their story, he drew near again. And so it is today. Jesus of Nazareth often walks close in disguise, resurrected, listening, understanding, and always available. And in the profound words of the great scholar Winnie the Pooh, A.A. Milne, I'd like to close with this quote. He said, "If ever there is a tomorrow when we're not together, there is something you must always remember. You are braver than you believe, stronger than you seem, and smarter than you think. But the most important thing is, even if we are apart, I'll always be with you."